She thought walking into the desert would be easier than facing the truth until a stranger with a badge knew her name. What happens when the one person who promised to protect you throws you away like yesterday's newspaper? When a young woman from Boston steps off a train in 1878 Arizona with nowhere to go and $3 to her name, the last thing she expects is a cowboy sheriff who seems to know everything about her betrayal. But Reed Callahan's calm voice stops her cold. Your journey ends with me, miss. Stay with me until the end of this story and comment the city you are watching from so I can see how far Clara's journey has traveled. The train whistle cut through the Arizona heat like a knife through butter, and Clara Winthrop felt her heart lurch with every metallic shriek. Dust swirled around the wooden platform of the depot, coating her dark traveling dress with a fine layer of grit that would have horrified her Boston friends. But Clara had left those friends behind 3 weeks ago, along with everything else she had ever known. Her fingers trembled as she gripped the handle of her worn leather valise, the only possession she had managed to keep after her mother's debts had swallowed their small inheritance whole. Inside were 2 dresses, a Bible her mother had given her before the fever took her, and a small Derringer pistol that Clara barely knew how to use. The weight of the gun had terrified her when she bought it from a pawn shop on her last day in Boston, but the ticket master had warned her that a woman traveling alone needed protection. Silver Creek Station, the conductor bellowed, his voice barely audible over the hissing steam. Silver Creek, 10-minute stop. Clara's chest tightened. This was it. The place where her father, the man who had abandoned her and her mother 15 years ago to chase silver and dreams in the Western Territories, had finally agreed to take her in. His letter had been brief, almost cold, but it was a lifeline when she had nothing else. Come to Silver Creek. I will meet you at the depot. We will talk then. 4 sentences, 15 years of silence, and he had given her 4 sentences. The train lurched to a complete stop, and Clara stepped down onto the platform, her button-up boots sinking slightly into the powdery dirt. The heat hit her like a physical force. Nothing like the humid summers of Massachusetts, but a dry, relentless warmth that seemed to pull moisture from her skin. She blinked against the brilliant sunlight, scanning the platform for a familiar face she was not even sure she would recognize. A handful of people milled about, a rancher loading supplies, 2 women in simple calico dresses chatting near a water barrel, a Mexican family hurrying 3 children toward the train. But no one approached her. No one called her name. Clara's stomach twisted into a knot. She waited as the 10 minutes stretched into 15, then 20. The conductor called for final boarding. Passengers climbed back onto the train. The rancher tipped his hat to her as he passed, curiosity flickering in his weathered face, but he did not speak. And then she saw him. A young man, no, a boy really, perhaps 16, was hurrying across the dusty street toward the depot. He wore a telegram messenger's cap and carried a yellow envelope in his hand. His eyes found Clara immediately, as if he had been looking for someone matching her description. Miss Winthrop, he called, slightly out of breath. Hope and dread warding Clara's chest. Yes. He thrust the telegram toward her. This came for you an hour ago, was supposed to be delivered to the previous station, but the lines were down. I am real sorry, miss. Clara's hand shook as she took the envelope. The boy shifted uncomfortably, then turned and hurried away before she could even think to tip him. Behind her, the train whistle screamed again, the final warning. She tore open the envelope. The words swam before her eyes, but their meaning sank into her bones like ice water. Clara, stop. Situation changed, stop. Remarried last month, stop. Wife does not want you here, stop. Do not come, stop, father. For a moment, Clara could not breathe. The platform seemed to tilt beneath her feet. The train's wheels began to turn, slowly at first, then gathering speed. The westbound engine, the one that would continue on to California to opportunities she had heard whispered about in boarding houses, pulled away from the station, taking with it her last chance to run somewhere, anywhere else. She was stranded in a town where she knew no one, with $3 in her reticule, a father who did not want her, and absolutely nowhere to go. The platform emptied quickly. The rancher drove his wagon away. The 2 women disappeared into a general store across the street. The Mexican family had boarded the train. Clara stood alone in the settling dust, the telegram still clutched in her hand, trying to understand how her life had come to this. Wife does not want you here. Not even I do not want you here. He had blamed it on his new wife, this woman Clara had never met, who had somehow convinced her father that his own daughter was not worth the inconvenience. A bitter laugh escaped her throat. She had been such a fool. Clara picked up her valise and began walking. She did not know where she was going, just away. Away from the depot, away from the pitying stares she imagined following her, away from the last shred of hope she had been clinging to. Silver Creek was not much of a town. The main street stretched perhaps a quarter mile, lined with the usual frontier establishments. A general store, a saloon, a boarding house, a sheriff's office, a church with a modest steeple. Beyond the buildings, the landscape opened into endless scrubland dotted with sagebrush and mesquite, with mountains rising purple and distant on the horizon. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way, and Clara hated it with every fiber of her being. She made it perhaps 200 yards past the last building before her legs began to shake. The heat, the shock, the weight of her dress and corset, it all crashed down on her at once. She stumbled, caught herself, and looked around wildly for somewhere to sit, somewhere to think. There was nothing, just endless desert stretching in every direction. Clara set down her valise and pressed her hands to her face, finally allowing the tears to come. They fell hot and fast, leaving tracks through the dust on her cheeks. She cried for her mother, for the father she had never really known, for the life she had imagined and lost in the span of a single telegram. Miss Winthrop. The voice came from behind her, deep, calm, with a slight western drawl that spoke of years under open skies. Clara spun around, her hand instinctively reaching for the derringer hidden in her pocket. Her fingers found the cool metal of the grip. The man standing 10 feet away raised his hands slowly, palms out. Easy now, I'm not here to hurt you. He was tall, over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled out his dark vest and white shirt. A silver star was pinned to his chest, catching the sunlight. His face was weathered but handsome, with sharp cheekbones and a strong jaw shadowed by a day's worth of stubble. But it was his eyes that caught Clara's attention. Gray as storm clouds, steady and knowing, with a depth of sadness that seemed to mirror her own. "How do you know my name?" Clara demanded, her voice shaking. Her fingers tightened on the derringer. "Your father told me you would be arriving today," the man said quietly. He did not move closer, did not make any threatening gestures. "I am Reed Callahan, Sheriff of Silver Creek." Clara's laugh was harsh, bitter. "Then I suppose he also told you not to expect me, that his new wife does not want me here." Something flickered across Reed Callahan's face. Sympathy, perhaps, or recognition. "I received a telegram this morning from Charles Winthrop asking me to meet you at the depot and explain the situation." "Explain?" Clara's voice rose despite herself. "What is there to explain?" "He does not want me. His letter made that perfectly clear. So you can tell them, that I will not be a burden. I will find my own way." She turned to pick up her valise, though she had no idea where she planned to go. Her vision swam with tears and heat and exhaustion. "Miss Winthrop," Reed's voice was gentle but firm. "It is 104 degrees in the shade right now. You have been traveling for weeks. You are exhausted, and if I am not mistaken, you do not have the funds to go anywhere else." Clara froze. "How dare you? Your father mentioned your circumstances," Reed continued, and now there was something harder in his tone. "He also mentioned that he was sending you here under false pretenses, that he had promised to take you in, then changed his mind without having the courage to tell you himself." Clara turned back to face him, anger replacing despair. "And you think that gives you the right to what? Pity me? Offer me charity?" "I think," Reed said slowly, "that you deserve better than to collapse from heat exhaustion in the desert because your father is a coward." The blunt words hit Clara like a slap. For a moment, she could only stare at him. Reed lowered his hands, though he still did not approach. "There is a boarding house in town. Mrs. Hartley runs it. She is a good woman, fair and honest. She needs help with the cooking and cleaning, and she will give you room and board in exchange for work. It is not glamorous, but it is honest. I do not need your help," Clara said. But the words sounded hollow, even to her own ears. "Maybe not," Reed agreed, But you do need a place to sleep tonight and some food in your belly, and time to figure out what comes next. Will you accept that much at least? Clara wanted to refuse, wanted to throw his offer back in his face and walk away with her pride intact. But pride would not buy her a meal. Pride would not give her shelter when the sun went down and the desert cold set in. And something in Reed Callahan's steady gaze told her that he understood exactly what she was feeling. The humiliation, the fear, the desperate need to maintain some shred of dignity in the face of utter ruin. One night she heard herself say, "I will stay one night, and then I will find my own way." Reed nodded, and Clara could have sworn she saw relief in his eyes. "That is all I am asking." He stepped forward and picked up her valise before she could protest. "Mrs. Hartley's place is just up the street. She is expecting you." Clara fell into step beside him, keeping a careful distance. Her hand remained in her pocket, fingers still touching the derringer. She might be desperate, but she was not stupid. They walked in silence for a few moments. Clara used the time to study Silver Creek more carefully. Up close, it was rougher than it had appeared from the depot. The buildings weathered by sun and wind, the streets deeply rutted from wagon wheels and horse hooves. But there was a sense of order to it, a feeling that despite its frontier roughness, this was a community that took care of its own. "Your father lives about 2 miles outside of town," Reed said suddenly, breaking the silence. "He and his new wife, Elizabeth, run a small ranch, cattle mostly." "I do not care," Clara said flatly. Reed glanced at her. "He wanted me to tell you. I said I do not care." Clara's voice was sharp. "Whatever excuse he has, whatever justification, I do not want to hear it. He made his choice, and I have made mine." Reed was quiet for a moment. "And what choice is that?" "To survive," Clara said simply. "To find a way forward that does not depend on anyone who has already proven they cannot be depended on." She felt Reed's eyes on her, but when she glanced over, his expression was unreadable. They reached the boarding house, a 2-story wooden structure with a wide porch and lace curtains in the windows. It was modest but well-maintained, with flower boxes under the windows and a hand-painted sign that read Hartley's Lodging House. Clean rooms, fair prices. Reed climbed the porch steps and knocked on the door. Within moments, it swung open to reveal a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and shrewd blue eyes that immediately assessed Clara from head to toe. "Mrs. Hartley," Reed said. "This is Miss Clara Winthrop. I can see that." Mrs. Hartley's voice was brisk but not unkind. "Come in, girl, before you faint on my porch. You look like you have been through the ringer." Clara bristled at being called a girl. She was 18, a woman grown, but she was too tired to argue. She climbed the steps and followed Mrs. Hartley inside. The interior was blessedly cool and surprisingly cheerful. Polished wooden floors, simple but sturdy furniture, and the smell of bread baking somewhere in the back. "Reed tells me you need work," Mrs. Hartley said, turning to face Clara with her hands on her hips. "I need help with the cooking, cleaning, laundry, and managing the guests. It is hard work. I will not lie to you about that. But you will get your own room, 3 meals a day, and a small wage besides. Enough to save up for a train ticket if that is what you are after." Clara swallowed hard. "What is the catch?" Mrs. Hartley's eyebrows rose. "Catch? In my experience," Clara said quietly, "nothing comes without strings attached." For the first time, Mrs. Hartley's stern expression softened slightly. "The only string is that you work hard and deal honestly with me and my guests. I run a respectable establishment, Miss Winthrop. I do not tolerate laziness, theft, or impropriety, but I also do not tolerate anyone taking advantage of my girls. You will be safe here, fed here, and treated fairly here. That is my word, and in Silver Creek, my word means something." Clara looked between Mrs. Hartley and Reed, searching for deception or hidden motives. But all she saw was honest concern and perhaps a touch of pity she desperately did not want. "I accept," she said finally. "Thank you." Mrs. Hartley nodded briskly. "Good. Reed, you can go now. Miss Winthrop needs to wash up and rest before supper, and I imagine she would like some privacy." Reed set Clara's valise down just inside the door. "Of course." He touched the brim of his hat, looking at Clara. "If you need anything, Miss Winthrop, the sheriff's office is just down the street. Do not hesitate." Clara nodded stiffly, not trusting herself to speak. She watched as Reed left, his footsteps heavy on the porch, then fading into the street. "He is a good man," Mrs. Hartley said quietly. "Lost his wife and baby daughter to fever 3 years back. Has not been quite the same since. But he takes care of this town like it is his own family." Clara said nothing. She did not want to hear about Reed Callahan's losses or his goodness. She did not want to feel anything for anyone in this godforsaken town. Mrs. Hartley seemed to understand. "Come on then, I will show you to your room." The week that followed established a rhythm that was both grueling and oddly comforting. Clara rose before dawn, helped prepare breakfast, cleaned rooms, washed laundry, assisted with lunch and dinner, and fell into bed each night, too exhausted to think. Her hands developed calluses, her back grew stronger, and slowly, grudgingly, she began to take a kind of pride in her work. Mrs. Hartley was demanding but never cruel. When Clara burned a batch of biscuits, the older woman simply showed her how to adjust the oven temperature. When Clara's bed-making did not meet standards, Mrs. Hartley demonstrated the proper hospital corners and had her practice until she got it right. "You are a quick learner," Mrs. Hartley observed on the fourth day, watching Clara expertly fold sheets. "That Boston education of yours is showing through." Clara felt a flush of pleasure at the praise, though she tried to hide it. Sarah proved to be a cheerful companion, chattering about town gossip as they worked side by side. Clara learned that the banker's wife was expecting her fifth child, that the saloon owner had gotten into a fistfight with a card cheat, that the rancher's son had proposed to the general store owner's daughter and been turned down flat. "You will meet everyone at the church social on Saturday," Sarah said excitedly as they hung laundry on Thursday afternoon. "There will be music and dancing and enough food to feed an army. Mrs. Hartley always makes her famous apple pie." "I am not much for socializing," Clara said carefully. "Oh, you have to come." Sarah's face fell. "Everyone will be there. It is the biggest event of the month, and Miss Pierce specifically asked me to make sure you knew you were invited." Clara had been avoiding thinking about Anna Pierce's Thursday evening gathering, which was happening that very night. She had planned to plead exhaustion and stay in her room, but Sarah's eager face and genuine kindness made her hesitate. "I do not know," she said slowly. "Please." Sarah clasped her hands together. "I promise it is not intimidating. We just sit and talk, and sometimes Miss Pierce reads to us from novels. Last week we discussed Jane Eyre. Do you know it?" Clara's heart gave a small leap. "I have read it several times, actually." "Then you have to come. Miss Pierce will be thrilled to have someone who can actually discuss the literary themes. Most of us just like the romance parts." Sarah grinned. "Please, Clara, I will feel so much braver if you are there with me." And so, at 6:45 that evening, Clara found herself walking to the church alongside Sarah, carrying the mending she had been working on. She had changed into her better dress, the dark blue one with modest trim, and pinned her hair carefully. Despite her determination to remain aloof, she found herself nervous about making a good impression. The church was a simple white building with a small steeple located at the far end of the main street. Sarah led Clara around to the back entrance where light spilled from a side room and the murmur of female voices could be heard. Inside, perhaps a dozen women sat in a loose circle, ranging in age from teenage to elderly. Anna Pierce stood at the front, arranging books on a small table. She looked up as Clara and Sarah entered, and her face brightened. "Miss Winthrop, I am so glad you came." Anna gestured to an empty chair. "Please sit. We are just getting started." Clara took the offered seat, acutely aware of the curious glances from the other women. Sarah settled beside her and immediately began introducing her to the group. There was Martha, the woman from the boarding house who had asked prying questions at dinner. Beside her sat two younger women, sisters apparently, who worked at the general store. An elderly woman with sharp eyes occupied the chair near the window, her gnarled hands flying over knitting needles. Three Mexican women sat together chatting quietly in Spanish. "Ladies," Anna called the group to order, "as you can see, we have a new member tonight. Miss Clara Winthrop has recently arrived from Boston and is working at Mrs. Hartley's boarding house. Clara, would you like to tell us a bit about yourself?" Clara's throat went dry. Every eye was on her, waiting. "There is not much to tell. I came west seeking family connections that did not work out. Mrs. Hartley kindly gave me employment. It was a careful half-truth that revealed nothing of substance. Anna seemed to understand because she smoothly moved on. We are continuing our discussion of Jane Eyre tonight. Last week, we left off with Jane's decision to leave Mr. Rochester after discovering his secret. I thought we might discuss whether her choice was brave or foolish. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Clara had expected. These frontier women, many of them with limited formal education, had surprisingly thoughtful opinions about Jane's moral dilemma, about duty versus desire, about what a woman owed herself versus what society demanded. Clara found herself drawn in despite her reservations. When Anna asked for her thoughts, she spoke carefully at first, then with growing confidence as the other women listened respectfully. I think Jane's choice was about maintaining her sense of self, Clara said. She had spent her whole life being told she was worthless, being made to feel small and unimportant. Mr. Rochester was the first person who made her feel valued, but staying with him under false pretenses would have destroyed the very thing he claimed to love, her integrity. Anna's eyes shone with approval. Exactly. She chose herself even when it cost her everything she wanted. But she suffered for it, Martha pointed out. She wandered starving and homeless. Was that really better than staying where she was loved and comfortable? Sometimes suffering is the price of self-respect, Clara heard herself say. The words came from somewhere deep and raw, and she realized too late that she was talking about more than a fictional character. The room fell quiet. Anna's gaze was gentle but knowing. Indeed. And in the end, Jane's integrity is rewarded. She inherits money, finds family, and returns to Mr. Rochester on her own terms, as his equal, not his dependent. That is the fairy tale part, though, is it not? One of the younger women said wistfully. In real life, women who walk away do not get happy endings. They just get more hardship. Sometimes, Anna agreed. But sometimes, if they are brave enough and strong enough, they create their own happy endings. Clara felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. She had not expected this simple book discussion to cut so close to her own wounded heart. After the formal discussion ended, the women broke into smaller groups, working on various projects while chatting. Sarah introduced Clara to the Mexican women, Maria, Rosa, and Esperanza, who welcomed her warmly and insisted she try the sweet bread they had brought to share. "Your English is beautiful," Maria said, her own accent thick but her meaning clear. "You could teach with Miss Pierce." "Oh no, I'm not a teacher," Clara protested. "You could be," Anna said, appearing beside them with cups of tea. "I am desperately in need of help at the school." The children ranged from 5 to 14, and I cannot possibly give them all the individual attention they need. If you have any interest in teaching, even just a few hours a week, I would be grateful. Clara accepted the tea, considering. "I do not have any formal training." "Neither did I when I started," Anna said with a smile. "But you are educated, articulate, and clearly intelligent. That is more than enough. Think about it." Before Clara could respond, the elderly woman with the knitting needles spoke up from across the room. "Anna Pierce, stop trying to recruit everyone for your school. The girl has been here less than a week. Let her catch her breath," Anna laughed. "You are right, Mrs. Chen. I apologize, Clara. I tend to get overeager about education." "Mrs. Chen," Clara repeated, startled by the name. The old woman's eyes twinkled. "My late husband was Chinese. I know, odd to find a Chinese-Irish woman in Arizona territory, but love does not much care about what is convenient." She fixed Clara with a penetrating stare. "You have got sadness in you, girl. Fresh wounds. Give them time to heal before making any big decisions." Clara found she could not look away from Mrs. Chen's knowing gaze. "How did you—" "I have been around long enough to recognize heartbreak," Mrs. Chen said simply, "and long enough to know it passes if you let it." The evening concluded with Anna reading aloud from a new novel she had ordered, Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. Her voice was expressive and engaging, and Clara found herself transported to London and exotic locales, forgetting for a blessed hour about her own troubles. Walking back to the boarding house with Sarah, Clara felt something she had not experienced since leaving Boston, a sense of belonging, however tentative. "Did you enjoy it?" Sarah asked hopefully. "I did," Clara admitted, "more than I expected to." Sarah beamed. "I knew you would. Miss Pierce has that effect on people. She makes you feel like you matter, like your thoughts are worth hearing." She squeezed Clara's arm. I am so glad you came. Will you come to the church social on Saturday too? Clara found herself smiling. A real smile, perhaps the first since she had arrived in Silver Creek. Yes, she said. I think I will. The next afternoon, after her morning chores were complete, Clara walked to the schoolhouse. It was a modest one-room building on the edge of town with glass windows and a small bell tower. Anna was sweeping the front steps when Clara arrived. You came, Anna set aside her broom, eyes bright with pleasure. Come in. Let me show you around. The interior was simple but well organized. Rows of wooden desks faced a blackboard at the front. Shelves along one wall held books and supplies. Sunshine streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. I have 18 students currently, Anna explained, walking Clara through the space. The youngest is 5, just learning his letters. The oldest is 14 and preparing to test for higher education. Most fall somewhere in between, basic reading, writing, and arithmetic. She showed Clara the curriculum she used, the primers and readers, the slate boards for practice. I try to teach in small groups organized by skill level, but it is challenging. While I am working with one group, the others are supposed to be doing independent work, but she laughed ruefully. Well, children being children, they often get distracted. How can I help? Clara found herself asking. Anna's face lit up. Could you work with the younger children on their letters and numbers? Even just 2 or 3 afternoons a week would make an enormous difference. I could pay you a small wage. It would not be much, but combined with your earnings from Mrs. Hartley, Clara did quick calculations. Between the boarding house wages, teaching money, and her father's guilt money sitting in the bank, she could actually save enough to have real choices. Independence, security. I will do it, she said. When can I start? Monday, Anna suggested hopefully. The children will be thrilled to have a new teacher. They shook hands, and Claire felt a strange sense of possibility opening before her. This was not the life she had planned, was not the future she had imagined, but it was something, a foundation she was building herself with her own hands and mind. Walking back to the boarding house, Clara passed the sheriff's office. Reed Callahan stood outside, talking to an older rancher. He glanced up as she approached, and their eyes met. Clara found herself pausing. Sheriff Callahan, Miss Winthrop. He excused himself from the rancher and walked over to her. You look different, less like you want to shoot someone. Despite herself, Clara felt her lips twitch. I have had a productive day. Miss Pierce offered me a teaching position at the school. Reed's eyebrows rose. And you accepted? I did. Clara tilted her chin up. You were right. I do have options. I am choosing to stay in Silver Creek, at least for now, to work, to save money, to build something for myself. Something shifted in Reed's expression. Respect, maybe, or approval. I'm glad to hear it. This town could use more people like you. People like me, Clara repeated skeptically. People with backbone, Reed said simply. People who do not give up when life knocks them down. People who fight their way back up and keep going. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. I am just doing what I have to do to survive. That is exactly what I mean. Reed's gray eyes held hers. Survival takes courage, Miss Winthrop. More courage than most people have. Do not sell yourself short. He touched his hat and returned to the rancher, leaving Clara standing on the dusty street, her heart doing strange things in her chest. She was still thinking about his words that evening as she helped serve dinner at the boarding house. Still thinking about them as she lay in bed that night, listening to the familiar sounds of Silver Creek settling into darkness. Sheriff Reed Callahan saw something in her that she did not see in herself. And despite her best efforts to remain detached and guarded, that recognition warmed something cold and frightened deep inside her. Clara closed her eyes and allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, what it might be like to truly belong here, to build a life in this rough frontier town, surrounded by people who valued her for who she was, rather than who her family had been. The thought terrified her, but it also, for the first time since her mother's death, gave her something that felt dangerously close to hope. The church social arrived with unseasonably warm weather and a buzz of excitement that swept through Silver Creek like wildfire. Clara had never seen the boarding house in such upheaval. Every woman in residence spent hours preparing, pressing their best dresses, curling their hair, debating which ribbons matched which bonnets. Even Mrs. Hartley, who normally maintained strict practicality, pinned a cameo brooch to her collar and allowed Sarah to arrange her gray hair in a softer style. Clara stood before her small mirror that Saturday afternoon, critically examining her reflection. She had chosen her mother's dress, the deep green silk that had been saved for special occasions, carefully preserved through all their hardships. It was slightly out of fashion now, the sleeves a bit fuller than current styles dictated, but the color brought out the amber flecks in her brown eyes, and the fabric still had a lustrous quality that spoke of better days. "You look beautiful," Sarah breathed from the doorway where she had been watching Clara's preparations. "That color is perfect on you." "It was my mother's," Clara said softly, smoothing the skirt. "I have been saving it for—" Well, I was not sure what for, but this seemed like the right occasion. Sarah stepped into the room, her own simple calico dress freshly pressed. "May I ask what happened to her? Your mother, I mean. You do not have to tell me if you do not want to." Clara was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the delicate lace at the cuffs. Fever, 2 years ago. She had been working herself to exhaustion, taking in sewing and laundry to keep us fed after the boarding school money ran out. Her body just gave up. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, and the simple sincerity in her voice made Clara's throat tight. "So am I." Clara turned from the mirror, blinking back the sting of tears. "But she would want me to go on living, to find joy where I can. So that is what I am trying to do." The walk to the church was pleasant in the cooling evening air. The entire town seemed to be heading in the same direction, families in their Sunday best, children running ahead with barely contained excitement, elderly folks moving at a more measured pace. The churchyard had been transformed. Long tables groaned under the weight of contributed dishes, roasted meats, fresh breads, vegetable casseroles, fruit pies, and cakes of every description. Lanterns hung from tree branches, casting warm pools of light as the sun began its descent. Someone had set up a small platform for musicians, and the sound of a fiddle being tuned drifted through the air. "Clara, Sarah!" Anna Pierce waved from near the dessert table where she was arranging slices of pound cake on a platter. "Come help me before I eat all of this myself." They spent the next half hour assisting with final preparations, arranging food, setting out plates and utensils, filling glasses with punch and lemonade. Clara found herself relaxing into the communal effort, the shared purpose of creating something welcoming and festive. "Miss Winthrop." The deep voice behind her made Clara's heart skip. She turned to find Sheriff Callahan standing there, hat in hand, wearing what appeared to be his Sunday suit. Dark trousers, a vest, and a white shirt that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. He had shaved, and his dark hair was neatly combed, though one stubborn lock fell across his forehead. "Sheriff," Clara managed, suddenly very aware of how the green silk dress fit her figure. Reed's eyes traveled over her face, down to the dress, then back up. Something flickered in those gray depths that made Clara's breath catch. "You look, that color suits you. Thank you." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. "You clean up rather well yourself." A hint of a smile touched Reed's mouth. "Mrs. Hartley threatened to bar me from the social if I showed up in my work clothes. Said she would not have her event ruined by a dusty sheriff." "Mrs. Hartley is a force of nature," Clara agreed, grateful for the mundane topic to steady her nerves. "That she is." Reed glanced around at the gathering crowd. "Would you save me a dance later? Assuming you dance, that is." Clara's stomach fluttered. "I have not danced in years. I am probably terrible." "Then we will be terrible together." Reed's smile widened slightly. The first waltz after dinner. Before Clara could respond, a commotion near the food tables drew their attention. A tall, weathered man in expensive ranch clothes was speaking loudly to Mrs. Hartley, his voice carrying across the yard. "I am just saying Elizabeth and I would like to contribute. We brought 3 pies and a whole smoked ham. Surely that earns us a welcome." Clara's entire body went cold. That voice, deeper than she remembered, roughened by years in whiskey, but unmistakable. Her father had come to the social. Reed's hand touched her elbow, steadying. "Clara, don't." The word came out sharper than she intended. "Please don't." Mrs. Hartley's voice rose, firm and unyielding. "Charles Winthrop, I told you this was not appropriate. Your daughter is a guest here, and she has made her feelings clear. She is my daughter, Charles protested. I have a right. You have no rights where she is concerned. Anna Pierce appeared beside Mrs. Hartley, her usually gentle face set in hard lines. You gave those up when you abandoned her at the depot. Clara watched frozen as her father's face reddened. A woman stood beside him, young, probably not yet 30, with blonde hair and a pinched, nervous expression. Elizabeth, presumably. The woman who had decided Clara was not worth the inconvenience. I made a mistake, Charles said, his voice lower now but still audible. I am trying to make it right. Surely she can understand that. Surely she can forgive. That is not your decision to make. Reed's voice cut through the tension like a blade. He had moved away from Clara, positioning himself between her and her father. Miss Winthrop has made her wishes known. You need to respect them and leave. Charles's eyes found Clara then, standing rigid near the punch table. Something passed over his face. Shame, perhaps, or regret. Clara, please, just give me 5 minutes. Let me explain. No, Clara was amazed her voice worked at all, given how her throat had closed. You explained everything in your letter. You chose your new wife over your daughter. There is nothing more to say. That is not fair. Elizabeth spoke for the first time, her voice high and defensive. We have limited resources. You could not be bothered, Clara heard herself say, surprising herself with the steadiness of her tone. You made your choice. Now live with it and leave me to live with mine. The yard had gone completely silent. Every eye was on them, and Clara felt the weight of all that attention like a physical pressure. But she kept her chin up, kept her gaze locked on her father's face. Charles Winthrop opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. I am sorry. I know that is not enough, but I am sorry. I know you are, Clara said quietly, but sorry does not change anything. Sorry does not give me back my mother or my childhood or the father I needed. It is just a word, Mr. Winthrop, and words are all you have ever given me. She turned and walked away, moving blindly through the crowd. She heard Reed call her name, heard Sarah's concerned voice, but she kept walking until she reached the edge of the churchyard where the lantern light faded into darkness. Clara pressed her hands to her face, willing herself not to cry, not to let her father steal this evening from her the way he had stolen so much else. She focused on breathing, in through her nose, out through her mouth, the way her mother had taught her when anxiety threatened to overwhelm. Footsteps approached, quiet but deliberate. Clara knew without looking that it was Reed. I am fine, she said before he could speak. I know you are. Reed stopped beside her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel his warmth. But you do not have to be fine all the time. Clara lowered her hands, staring out at the darkening desert. If I am not fine, if I let myself feel everything I am feeling, I will fall apart, and I cannot afford to fall apart. Why not? Reed's voice was gentle. Why can you not let yourself grieve? Let yourself be angry. Let yourself hurt. Because if I start, I'm afraid I will not be able to stop. The admission came out barely above a whisper. I am afraid if I let the dam break, I will drown in it. Reed was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, 3 years ago, when I lost Mary and little Sarah, I tried to do exactly what you are doing. I tried to stay strong, stay in control, keep functioning. I thought if I just kept moving forward, the pain would eventually fade. Clara looked at him, seeing the old grief etched in the lines of his face. But it does not work that way, Reed continued. The pain does not fade when you ignore it. It just builds and builds until it comes out sideways. In anger, in bitterness, in walls so thick nobody can get through them. He met her eyes. I do not want that for you, Clara. You deserve better than a life spent hiding from your own heart. I do not know how to be any other way, Clara said helplessly. Then learn. Reed's hand found hers in the darkness, his calloused fingers warm and solid. Let people in. Let yourself feel. It will hurt like hell, but on the other side of that hurt is something worth having. What? Clara asked. What is worth all this pain? Connection. Community. Maybe even love, if you are brave enough. Reed squeezed her hand gently. You are not alone anymore, Clara. You do not have to carry everything by yourself. Clara wanted to pull away, to retreat into the safe isolation she had built around herself. But Reed's hand in hers felt like an anchor, solid and real. And some part of her, the part that was so tired of being strong alone, wanted desperately to believe him. Before she could respond, Anna appeared at the edge of the light. "Clara, Reed, they're about to start the music. And Clara, your father and his wife have left." Mrs. Hartley made sure of it. Clara took a shaky breath. "Thank you. Come back to the social," Anna urged. "Do not let him take this from you. You have been working so hard. You deserve an evening of joy." Reed released Clara's hand, stepping back to give her space. "The choice is yours. But I meant what I said. I would like that dance if you are willing." Clara looked between them, Anna with her encouraging smile, Reed with his steady, patient gaze. Behind them, the sounds of the social continued. Laughter, conversation, the first strains of a fiddle playing a lively tune. Life going on despite her drama, inviting her to join if she chose. "All right," she heard herself say, "one dance." Reed's smile was like sunrise. "One dance is all I am asking." They returned to the social together, and if people stared or whispered, Clara forced herself not to care. She filled a plate with food she barely tasted, made conversation with Sarah and the women from the Thursday gathering, and tried to recapture the sense of belonging she had felt before her father's appearance. The musicians launched into a proper waltz just as darkness settled completely over the churchyard. Couples moved on to the makeshift dance floor, ranchers with their wives, young people courting, even Mrs. Hartley being spun around by the elderly banker. Reed appeared at Clara's elbow. "I believe you promised me this dance." Clara's heart hammered as she took his offered hand. "I warned you I am rusty. Lucky for you, I am not much of a dancer either." Reed led her onto the floor, one hand settling at her waist, the other holding hers. "Just follow my lead and try not to step on my feet too often." The first few steps were awkward as Clara tried to remember the patterns she had learned years ago at the boarding school. But Reed was patient, guiding her through the turns, keeping the rhythm steady. Gradually, muscle memory took over, and she found herself relaxing into the movement. "See," Reed said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "You are doing fine." Clara looked up at him, suddenly very aware of how close they were, how his hand felt at her waist, how his gray eyes reflected the lantern light. "This is dangerous," she said without thinking. Reed's brow furrowed. "Oh, dancing? No. This," Clara gestured vaguely between them. "Letting myself, letting people in. Like you said, it is dangerous. People leave, they down, they choose someone else. Letting myself care just means giving them the power to hurt me." Reed's hand tightened slightly on hers. "That is true. Caring about people is the biggest risk there is. But Clara, living without caring, that is not really living at all. That is just existing, surviving. Is that really all you want from life?" "It is safer," Clara whispered. "Safer," Reed agreed, "but lonelier, emptier. And you are worth more than a safe, empty life." The music swelled around them, and Clara felt something crack in her chest. Not breaking, but opening. "How do you know?" she asked. "How do you know I am worth it?" Reed's smile was sad and knowing. "Because I see you, Clara Winthrop. I see how hard you work, how you refuse to give up even when you have every reason to. I see your strength and your kindness underneath all that fear. I see who you could be if you let yourself." Tears blurred Clara's vision, but she blinked them back. "You barely know me. I know enough." The waltz was ending, the music slowing. Reed did not release her immediately, and "I would like to know more, if you will let me." The next 2 weeks fell into a new pattern. Clara's days were split between the boarding house and the schoolhouse, and she discovered a talent for teaching that surprised her. The younger children responded to her patient explanations and gentle corrections. Even the older students, initially skeptical of the new teacher from Boston, began to warm to her. Reed stopped by the schoolhouse several afternoons each week, ostensibly to check on security, but really, Clara suspected, to see her. They fell into easy conversations about the children's progress, about town news, about books they had both read. Sometimes he would bring her coffee from the general store. Once he brought her a book he thought she would enjoy, a volume of Tennyson's poetry that must have cost him a week's wages. "You should not have," Clara protested when he presented it. "I wanted to," Reed said simply. "I saw it in the catalog at the store and thought of you." Clara ran her fingers over the embossed cover, touched beyond words. Thank you, truly. Their relationship, if it could be called that, existed in a strange liminal space. More than friendship, but not quite courtship. Defined by meaningful looks and hands that almost touched. Conversations that hinted at deeper feelings neither was quite brave enough to voice. Anna noticed, of course. Sheriff Callahan seems quite taken with you, she observed one Thursday evening after the reading group. Clara felt a heat rise in her cheeks. We are friends. Friends, Anna repeated with a knowing smile. Is that what we are calling it? I do not know what else to call it, Clara admitted. I do not know what he wants, and I am not sure I am ready to find out. Anna's expression grew more serious. Reed Callahan is a good man, Clara. One of the best I have known. He has been alone for a long time, locked in his grief. If he is opening his heart to you, that is significant. That is what scares me, Clara said quietly. What if I am not ready? What if I hurt him? What if I cannot be what he needs? What if you can, Anna countered. What if you are exactly what he needs, and he is exactly what you need? But fear keeps you both from finding that out. Clara had no answer to that. The answer came unbidden on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after the church social. Clara was teaching the younger children their letters when a telegram messenger appeared at the schoolhouse door. Miss Clara Winthrop? He asked breathlessly. Clara's heart sank. Nothing good ever came by telegram. Yes, this came for you. It is urgent, marked immediate. Clara took the yellow envelope with shaking hands. The children watched with wide eyes as she tore it open. The words swam before her vision, but their meaning was brutally clear. Clara, stop. Your Aunt Margaret gravely ill. Stop. Doctors say days, not weeks. Stop. Request your presence. Stop. Funds for travel wired to Silver Creek Bank. Stop. Family lawyer Henderson. Clara read it twice, 3 times, trying to make sense of it. Aunt Margaret, her mother's sister, the woman who had grudgingly paid for her boarding school, who had made clear that Clara was an obligation rather than family. She was dying and she wanted Clara. Miss Winthrop, one of the older students, a bright girl named Emma, looked concerned. Are you all right? Clara realized she was crushing the telegram in her fist. Yes, continue with your copywork, please. I need to speak with Miss Pierce. She found Anna in the back room preparing materials for the next day's lessons. Anna took one look at Clara's face and set down her supplies. What has happened? Clara handed her the telegram. Anna read it quickly, sympathy flooding her features. Oh, Clara, I am so sorry. I have to go, Clara heard herself say. I have to go to Boston. She is my mother's sister. Whatever our differences, I cannot let her die alone. Of course not, Anna agreed. When will you leave? As soon as possible. Tomorrow, if there is a train. Clara's mind was already racing ahead, calculating what she needed to do. I will need to tell Mrs. Hartley, arrange for someone to cover my duties at the boarding house, pack. We will handle everything, Anna assured her. Do not worry about the school. I will manage until you return. Until you return. The words hung in the air, heavy with assumption. Clara realized she had not thought that far ahead. Would she return? Boston was her past, the place she had fled, but it was also where her mother was buried, where her few remaining family connections existed. And Silver Creek was, what, a temporary refuge, a place she had stumbled into by accident? Or was it becoming something more? I do not know if I am coming back, Clara said quietly. Anna's eyes widened. Clara, I do not know, Clara repeated more firmly this time. My aunt might need ongoing care. There might be estate matters to settle. I do not know. You should tell Reed, Anna said. He deserves to know you are leaving. Clara's chest tightened. Reed, how did she tell him she was leaving when she was not sure herself if it was temporary or permanent? How did she explain that the thought of saying goodbye to him hurt almost as much as the thought of her aunt's impending death? She found him at his office an hour later, after dismissing the school children early and explaining the situation to a tearful Sarah. Reed was at his desk working through paperwork, but he stood immediately when Clara entered. Clara, I was just thinking about you. There is a new shipment of books at the general store, and I thought. He stopped, reading her expression. What is wrong? Clara handed him the telegram without speaking. Reed read it, his jaw tightening. When do you leave? Tomorrow morning. There is a train at 8. Tomorrow. Reed set the telegram on his desk carefully, as if it might explode. That is soon. I know. Clara twisted her hands together. I have to go, Reed. She is family. She is all the family I have left. I understand. Reed's voice was carefully neutral, but his eyes betrayed him. Of course you have to go. The silence stretched between them, thick with everything they were not saying. Reed, Clara. They spoke simultaneously, then both stopped. Reed gestured for her to continue. I do not know how long I will be, Clara said, the words tumbling out in a rush. My aunt might need care for weeks or months. There might be legal matters to handle. And Boston it is where my mother is buried, where my past is. I do not know what I might need to do. Are you coming back? Reed asked bluntly. Clara looked at him, really looked at him, at the strong lines of his face, the gray eyes that saw too much, the way he stood perfectly still as if bracing for a blow. I do not know, she whispered. I honestly do not know. Something flickered across Reed's face. Pain, quickly shuddered. I see. Do you? Clara stepped closer, desperate to make him understand. Reed, I have been here less than 2 months. 2 months ago, I had nothing. No home, no prospects, no future. And then Silver Creek happened. You happened. Anna and Mrs. Hartley in the school, and all of it happened. But I do not know if it is real. I do not know if I am building something lasting or just hiding from my past. And you think going back to Boston will help you figure that out? Reed's voice was gentle but pointed. Maybe. Clara's eyes burned with unshed tears. Or maybe it will make me realize that this, Silver Creek, the life I am building here, is exactly what I have been looking for all along. But I need to know, Reed. I need to face my past so I can choose my future. Can you understand that? Reed was quiet for a long moment. Then he crossed the distance between them and took her hands in his. I understand more than you know. When Mary died, I tried to run from the pain, tried to bury myself in work and duty and anything that would keep me from feeling. It did not work. The past caught up with me anyway, and I had to face it whether I wanted to or not. He squeezed her hands gently. So yes, I understand, and I will not ask you to stay, will not ask you to choose before you are ready. But Clara, his voice roughened with emotion, I need you to know something before you go. Clara's heart hammered. What? I love you. The words fell between them like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread outward. I know it is too soon. I know you are not ready to hear it. But you are leaving tomorrow, and I cannot let you go without saying it. I love you, Clara Winthrop. Your strength, your courage, your wounded heart that keeps fighting to heal. All of it, all of you. Clara could not breathe, could not speak, could not do anything but stare at Reed as his confession washed over her. You do not have to say anything, Reed continued, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. You do not have to feel the same way. But when you are in Boston, facing your past and making your choices, I want you to know that you have someone here who loves you, who will be waiting for you if you choose to come back, who will understand if you do not. Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks. Reed, he released one of her hands to cup her face, his thumb brushing away her tears. Go to Boston, take care of your aunt, face whatever you need to face, and when you are ready, when you know what you want, you will know where to find me. Clara rose on her toes and kissed him. A brief, trembling press of lips that conveyed everything she could not put into words. Hope and fear and gratitude, and something that might be love, if she was brave enough to name it. When she pulled back, Reed's eyes were bright. Was that goodbye? He asked quietly. I do not know, Clara said honestly. Maybe it is hello. Maybe it is both. I do not know anything right now, except that I am terrified and you are the only person who makes me feel like I might survive this. Reed pulled her into his arms, holding her close while she cried against his chest. You will survive it, he murmured into her hair. You are the strongest person I know. And whatever you decide, wherever you end up, you will be all right. Will I? Clara asked, her voice muffled against his shirt. Yes, Reed's certainty wrapped around her like a warm blanket. Because you are Clara Winthrop, and you do not know how to give up. The morning Clara left Silver Creek, Reed Callahan stood on the depot platform in the gray dawn light, his hat in his hands. He had told himself he would not come, that saying goodbye once was hard enough, but his feet had carried him here anyway, drawn by the desperate need to see her one more time. Clara appeared with Mrs. Hartley and Sarah, her worn valise in hand, the same one she had carried when she first arrived. But everything else about her was different. She stood straighter now, held her head higher. The terrified, broken woman who had walked away from this very depot months ago had been replaced by someone stronger, more certain of her own worth. Their eyes met across the platform, and Clara's steps faltered. "You came, I should not have," Reed admitted, "but I could not let you leave without—" He stopped, unsure what he had come to say that had not already been said. Mrs. Hartley tactfully steered Sarah toward the ticket window, giving them privacy. Clara set down her valise and stepped closer to Reed. "I am glad you are here," she said softly. "I wanted to see you again, but I did not know how to ask." Reed reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound journal. "I thought you might want this for the journey. Anna mentioned she gave you one, but I thought, well, 2 journals are better than 1. Clara took it, her fingers brushing his. The journal was beautiful, clearly expensive, with her initials embossed on the cover in gold. "Reed, this is too much. It is not enough," Reed said. "But it is what I have to give. Write in it. Write about Boston, about your aunt, about whatever you are feeling. And Clara," his voice dropped lower, "if you decide not to come back, write me a letter. Do not just disappear. I need to know you are all right, even if you are all right somewhere else." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "I do not want to hurt you." "Then come back," Reed said simply. "But if you cannot, if Boston is where you need to be, then tell me that. Just do not leave me wondering." The train whistle sounded in the distance, and they both turned to watch the engine approaching through the morning mist. Time was running out. Clara rose on her toes and kissed Reed. Longer this time, pouring into it all the feelings she could not name. When she pulled back, both of them were shaking. "All right," she promised. "Whether I am coming back or not, I will write. That is all I am asking." Reed picked up her valise and walked with her to the train. He helped her aboard, his hand steady on her elbow, and then stood back as she found a window seat. Clara pressed her palm against the glass. Reed mirrored the gesture from the platform, their hands separated by mere inches of glass but a gulf of uncertainty. The train lurched forward. Clara kept her eyes on Reed as the depot slid away, watching him grow smaller and smaller until he was just a dark figure in the distance, then nothing at all. Only then did she allow herself to crumb. The journey east was nothing like the desperate westward flight that had brought Clara to Arizona. This time she traveled with purpose and funds, sleeping in actual berths instead of sitting up all night, eating in dining cars instead of subsisting on hard rolls and cheese. The landscape rolled by in reverse, desert giving way to plains, plains to forests, forests to the familiar eastern countryside. Clara wrote in both journals, Reed's and Anna's. In Anna's, she wrote about the practical details of her journey, the people she met, her observations about how the country changed from west to east. In Reed's journal, the one with her initials in gold, she wrote the truth of her heart. "I miss you already," she wrote on the second night. "How is that possible? I have known you for such a short time, yet the thought of never seeing you again makes it hard to breathe. The woman I was when I left Boston would have laughed at this, at the idea that a frontier sheriff could matter so much. But I am not that woman anymore. You changed me, Reed. Silver Creek changed me. I just do not know if the change is permanent or if I will revert to who I was once I am back in familiar territory." Boston appeared on the 6th day, rising from the landscape like a memory made solid. The brick buildings, the cobblestone streets, the crush of people. It was all achingly familiar and yet somehow foreign. Clara realized with a start that she had become accustomed to wide open spaces and clear skies. The close quarters and gray fog of Boston felt oppressive. A hired carriage took her to her aunt's townhouse in Beacon Hill, an elegant 3-story structure that spoke of old money and older traditions. The housekeeper who answered the door, Mrs. Walsh, who had been with Aunt Margaret for 30 years, looked genuinely pleased to see Clara. "Miss Winthrop, thank goodness you have come. Your aunt will be so relieved." Clara was led upstairs to a bedroom that had been converted into a sick room. Heavy curtains blocked most of the light, and the air smelled of medicine and something else, something that reminded Clara too much of her mother's final days. Aunt Margaret lay in the massive four-poster bed, looking impossibly small and frail. She had always been a formidable woman, tall and stern, with steel gray hair and piercing blue eyes that could reduce grown men to stammering boys. Now those eyes were faded and dim, her once sturdy frame reduced to skin and bones. Clara, her voice was a whisper. You came. Clara crossed to the bed and took her aunt's withered hand. Of course I came. You are family. Aunt Margaret's laugh turned into a cough. Family? That is rich. I treated you terribly after your mother died. Sent you off to school and washed my hands of you. Why would you come for me? Because my mother would want me to, Clara said simply. And because, despite everything, you did provide for me when you did not have to. That counts for something. Tears leaked from the corners of Aunt Margaret's eyes. Your mother was the good one, the kind one. I was always harder, more practical. She used to say I had a heart of stone. Hearts of stone do not cry, Clara pointed out gently. Over the next 2 weeks, Clara settled into a routine of caring for her dying aunt. The doctor came daily, adjusting medications and shaking his head gravely. Mrs. Walsh handled the household with practiced efficiency, giving Clara space to simply be present. And slowly, painfully, Aunt Margaret began to talk. Really talk about the past. I resented your mother for marrying your father, she confessed one afternoon. We came from a good family, had prospects. She could have married well, secured her future. Instead, she fell in love with a charming dreamer who left her with nothing but broken promises and a child to raise alone. She never regretted it, Clara said. Even at the end, even when we had nothing, she said loving him had been worth it. Aunt Margaret turned her head on the pillow to look at Clara. Do you understand that now? Is there someone in Arizona who has made you understand why your mother chose love over security? Clara thought of Reed standing on the platform watching her leave. Maybe, I do not know yet. Then you are smarter than your mother was, Aunt Margaret said, or perhaps more cautious. There is wisdom in both. As the days passed, Clara found herself writing to Reed every evening, long letters that she sealed and posted before she could second-guess herself. She told him about her aunt's condition, about the conversations they were having, about how strange it felt to be back in Boston. She told him about walking to the cemetery where her mother was buried, about standing at the grave and finally, truly saying goodbye. Reed's responses came regularly, forwarded from Silver Creek. His letters were shorter than hers, but no less meaningful. He wrote about the daily happenings in town, how Sarah was managing well at the boarding house, how Anna sent her regards, how the school children asked about Miss Winthrop every day. He wrote about a particularly difficult cattle rustling case he had solved, about the new preacher who had arrived and was causing quite a stir with his passionate sermons. But he never pressured her to return, never asked when she was coming back. He simply wrote as if they were two people sharing their lives across distance. And Clara loved him for that restraint, even as it made her heart ache. 3 weeks after Clara's arrival, Aunt Margaret rallied enough to ask for her lawyer. Mr. Henderson arrived with his leather satchel full of documents, and Clara was asked to sit in on the meeting. I am changing my will, Aunt Margaret announced without preamble. Everything, the house, the investments, the trust funds, goes to Clara. Clara's eyes widened. Aunt Margaret, I cannot. You can and you will. Her aunt interrupted with a flash of her old imperious nature. There is no one else. Your cousins have their own money, their own families. You are my sister's daughter, and this is how I make amends for failing both of you. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat. Miss Winthrop, your aunt's estate is quite substantial. The house alone is worth approximately $15,000. The investments and trust funds total another $30,000. You would be a wealthy woman. The numbers were staggering. $45,000. More money than Clara had ever imagined having. Enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life, to travel, to do anything she wanted. Enough to never have to depend on anyone again. I do not know what to say, Clara managed. Say you will use it wisely, Aunt Margaret said. Say you will build a life that makes you happy, not one that makes you safe. Your mother chose love and died poor but content. I chose security, and I am dying wealthy but alone. Find the balance, Clara. That is all I ask, Mr. Henderson drew up the new documents, and Aunt Margaret signed with a shaking hand. When it was done, she lay back against her pillows, exhausted but peaceful. There is something else, she said to Clara. In my jewelry box, top drawer of the bureau, the emerald ring. It was your grandmother's. Should have gone to your mother. I want you to have it. Clara retrieved the ring, a stunning emerald surrounded by small diamonds set in gold. It was the kind of ring that spoke of heritage and history, of family bonds that transcended petty resentments. It is beautiful, Clara breathed. It is yours, Aunt Margaret said. Wear it or sell it or give it away. Just promise me something. Clara, anything. Promise me you will not let fear make your choices. I did that. I chose safety over love, duty over desire, and now I am dying with regrets instead of memories. Do not be like me. Be brave. Be like your mother, just with better judgment about men. Clara laughed through her tears, I promise. That night, Clara wrote to Reed about the inheritance, about her aunt's advice. She poured out her confusion and fear onto the pages, trying to make sense of what this money meant for her future. I could do anything now, she wrote. I could buy my own house here in Boston, rejoin the society I left behind. I could travel to Europe, see all the places I have only read about. I could start a school of my own, or open a bookshop, or simply live quietly on the interest from the investments. The world is open to me in ways it never was before. She paused, staring at the words she had written. But all I can think about is a small Arizona town with dusty streets and honest people, about a boarding house where I learned the value of hard work, about a one-room schoolhouse where children called me Miss Winthrop with respect, about a sheriff with gray eyes who sees me, really sees me, in ways no one else ever has. Clara set down her pen and walked to the window, looking out at the gas-lit streets of Boston. This city had been her home, her prison, her past. It held her mother's grave and her family's history. It offered her security and status, and all the trappings of civilized society. But it did not hold her heart. The realization settled over her like morning light, clear and undeniable. Her heart was in Silver Creek, with Reed Callahan. Her future, if she was brave enough to claim it, waited in the Arizona territory, not in the drawing rooms of Boston. Aunt Margaret died peacefully in her sleep 4 days later. Clara was sitting beside her bed, reading aloud from Pride and Prejudice, when she noticed the change in her aunt's breathing. By the time Mrs. Walsh arrived with the doctor, it was over. The funeral was a grand affair, attended by Boston's elite. Clara stood in her black mourning dress, accepting condolences from people who had never given her a second thought when she was poor. She recognized the hollowness in their sympathy, the calculation in their eyes as they assessed the newly wealthy Miss Winthrop. These people were not her community. They never had been. The estate settlement took another 3 weeks. Mr. Henderson proved to be both efficient and kind, walking Clara through every detail of her inheritance. The house was put up for sale, the investments transferred to her name. Clara kept only a few pieces of furniture with sentimental value and her grandmother's jewelry, including the emerald ring. What will you do now? Mr. Henderson asked at their final meeting. Will you stay in Boston? Clara looked at the ring on her finger, remembering her aunt's words about being brave. No, I'm going back to Arizona. The lawyer's eyebrows rose. Arizona? My dear, with your fortune, you could live anywhere. Surely you would be more comfortable here. Or perhaps New York, or... I am going back to Arizona, Clara repeated firmly. That is where I belong. She spent her last week in Boston tying up loose ends and saying goodbye. She visited her mother's grave one final time, placing flowers on the headstone and whispering a promise to live the kind of life that would make her proud. She donated most of her aunt's books to the public library and arranged for several pieces of furniture to be shipped west. And every evening she wrote to Reed, though she did not tell him about her decision. That news needed to be delivered in person. On her final night in Boston, Clara sat in the empty townhouse, now sold to a young lawyer and his family, and wrote her last journal entry. Tomorrow I go home. Not to the Boston of my childhood, not to the life I thought I wanted, but to Silver Creek, to the life I have chosen. I have money now, independence, security. I do not need Reed Callahan to take care of me. I do not need anyone. But I want him. I want the life we could build together. I want to teach in Anna's school and have coffee with Mrs. Hartley and watch sunsets over the Arizona desert. I want all of it, not because I have no other options, but because I have seen what else is available. And I choose this. I choose love. I choose home. I choose Reed. The train journey west felt endless. Clara changed trains in Chicago, then Kansas City, counting down the miles until she reached Silver Creek. She had sent one telegram to Mrs. Hartley announcing her return, but she had asked the older woman not to tell anyone else. She wanted to surprise Reed, wanted to see his face when she arrived. The landscape changed from green to brown to red as she traveled, and Clara felt her heart lift with every mile. This was right. This was home. The train pulled into Silver Creek's depot on a Wednesday afternoon in late October. Clara stepped onto the familiar platform, breathing in the dry desert air and feeling something settle deep in her chest. Peace, certainty, joy. Mrs. Hartley was waiting, beaming with pleasure. "Welcome home, dear girl. Look at you, so elegant in your traveling suit. I barely recognize you." Clara laughed and embraced the older woman. "It is good to be back. I have missed this place more than I can say. We have missed you too. The whole town has." Mrs. Hartley picked up Clara's new valise, expensive now, a far cry from the battered one she had carried before. "Reed has been like a bear with a sore paw since you left. Snapping at everyone, working himself to exhaustion. That boy is in love with you, Clara. I hope you have come back to do something about it." Clara's pulse quickened. "Where is he?" "Out on patrol. Will not be back until tomorrow morning." Mrs. Hartley saw Clara's disappointment and patted her arm. "Come back to the boarding house. Get settled. He will be all the more delighted to see you when he returns." But Clara shook her head. A plan was forming. "Actually, Mrs. Hartley, I need your help with something." That evening, while Reed was still out on patrol, Clara put her plan into motion. With Mrs. Hartley and Anna's assistance, she arranged for a message to be delivered to Reed's office first thing in the morning, asking him to come to the schoolhouse at noon on urgent business. Then Clara went to the school and transformed it. She brought flowers from the general store, wildflowers and desert blooms that thrived in Arizona soil. She set up a table with a white cloth and the good china Mrs. Hartley loaned her. She prepared a simple lunch of the food she had learned Reed favored during their months of friendship. Roast chicken, fresh bread, apple pie, and she waited. The morning crawled by. Clara changed her dress 3 times, settled on the blue silk, then changed again to a simple yellow cotton that seemed less presumptuous. She arranged and rearranged the flowers. She practiced what she wanted to say, then abandoned her planned speech as too formal. At 11:45, she heard boots on the wooden steps outside. Her heart leaped into her throat. The door opened, and Reed Callahan stepped inside. He looked tired, Clara noted immediately, thinner than she remembered, with new lines around his eyes. His face was dusty from the trail, his clothes worn from hard use. But his eyes, those steady gray eyes, were exactly as she remembered. He stopped dead when he saw her, his hat falling from his hands. "Clara," she stepped forward, drinking in the sight of him. "Hello, Reed, you are here." His voice was rough, disbelieving. "You are really here. I am really here." Clara's hands twisted together nervously. "I know you were not expecting me, Mrs. Hartley's message was a trick. I wanted to surprise you." Reed crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping just short of touching her. His eyes searched her face desperately. "How long? How long are you staying?" Clara reached up and cupped his face in her hands, feeling the rough stubble of his jaw, the warmth of his skin. "I am staying, Reed. I am staying forever if you will have me." His eyes closed, and when they opened again, they were bright with unshed tears. "Clara, let me finish," she interrupted. "I need to say this. I went to Boston to face my past, and I did. My aunt died and left me her entire estate. I am wealthy now, Reed, independently wealthy. I do not need anyone to take care of me. I do not need rescue or charity or even a home, because I can provide all of that for myself." Reed's face had gone very still, and Clara saw something that might have been resignation in his eyes. "But here is what I do need," she continued, her voice strengthening. I need you. I need your steady presence and your quiet strength. I need your patience and your kindness and the way you see the best of me even when I cannot see it myself. I need your love, Reed Callahan. Not because I am dependent on it, but because it makes me better, braver, more fully myself. She took a shaking breath. You told me you loved me before I left, and I did not say it back because I was too scared. But I am not scared anymore. I love you. I love you with everything I am. And I have come back to Silver Creek, to you, to build the life we both deserve. If you still want me, if I have not waited too long. The silence that followed seemed to last forever. Then Reed pulled her into his arms, crushing her against his chest, his face buried in her hair. If I still want you, his voice broke. Clara, I have thought of nothing but you for 3 months, waited for every letter like a drowning man waiting for air. I told myself I would let you go if that was what you needed. But God, I was hoping you would come back. Clara pulled back enough to look up at him. I came back, and I am not leaving again. This is home now. You are home. Reed kissed her then, a kiss nothing like the brief, uncertain ones they had shared before. This was a claiming, a promise, a declaration. Clara melted into it, wrapping her arms around his neck and kissing him back with all the love and certainty she had been storing up for months. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Reed rested his forehead against hers. Marry me. Clara laughed, joy bubbling up irresistibly. That is not a question. Marry me, Reed tried again, smiling. Please, as soon as possible. Because I have loved you since you walked away from the depot with $3 and a Derringer, and I do not want to wait another day to make you my wife. Yes, Clara said, the word coming easily, perfectly. Yes, I will marry you tomorrow, next week, whenever you want. Just yes. They kissed again, softer this time, sealing the promise. Outside, Silver Creek went about its business, unaware that in the little schoolhouse, two wounded hearts were finally finding their way home to each other. They were married 2 weeks later in the small white church where Clara had attended her first social gathering. The delay was only because Clara insisted on doing things properly. She wanted a real wedding, not a hasty ceremony that people would gossip about. She wanted to stand up before this community that had adopted her and make her vows with intention and joy. The church was packed, every pew filled, with people standing along the walls and crowding in the doorway. Clara processed down the aisle on Mrs. Hartley's arm. The older woman had tearfully accepted Clara's request to stand in as family. Her eyes found Reed immediately. He stood at the altar with the new preacher, wearing his best suit, his dark hair neatly combed. But it was his expression that made Clara's breath catch. Such open, unguarded love that she felt tears prick her eyes. This man, this good, steady, honorable man was choosing her, and she was choosing him. The ceremony was simple and beautiful. They recited traditional vows, their voices steady and sure. When Reed slipped his mother's wedding ring onto Clara's finger, a plain gold band worn smooth by years of wear, she felt the weight of it like a promise kept. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Reed's kiss was gentle and reverent, a beginning rather than an ending. Even Clara's father approached during the reception, Elizabeth hovering nervously at his side. He looked older than Clara remembered, gray threading through his hair, his face lined with care and regret. Clara, he said, his voice rough, thank you for letting me come. It means more than you know. Clara studied him for a long moment. She could hold on to her anger, nurse her resentment, make him pay for his failures. Or she could choose differently. Choose the kind of grace her mother would have shown. I am glad you are here, she said finally, and was surprised to find she meant it. This is my husband, Sheriff Reed Callahan. Reed, this is my father, Charles Winthrop, and his wife, Elizabeth. The introduction was stiff and formal, but it was a start. Reed shook Charles's hand with careful courtesy, and Elizabeth managed a tremulous smile. Reed studied her face later that evening. You are really all right with him being part of our lives? I am, Clara said honestly. I will never forget what he did, how he hurt me. But I have learned that holding on to anger hurts me more than it hurts him. And the children we will have someday deserve to know their grandfather, flaws and all. You are a better person than I am, Reed said quietly. No, Clara disagreed. I am just a person who has learned that love is stronger than resentment, That forgiveness, real forgiveness, sets you free. She smiled at him. You taught me that, you and this whole town. You showed me what it means to truly belong somewhere. Years later, when Clara was an old woman with silver hair and grandchildren of her own, people would ask her about her life story. They had heard the legend. The wealthy Boston lady who had come to Silver Creek with nothing and built an empire of education and community service. The woman who had turned a small frontier school into the largest educational institution in the territory. The philanthropist who had used her inheritance to fund libraries and hospitals and scholarships for children who otherwise would never have had a chance. But when Clara told the story, she always started the same way. I was walking away from the depot, she would say, her voice still clear despite her age, broken and alone with nowhere to go and no one to turn to, until a cowboy sheriff stopped me and said words that changed everything. Your journey ends with me, miss. She would pause then, her eyes distant with memory. But he was wrong, you see. My journey did not end that day. It began again. It began with trust and grew through friendship and blossomed into love. It began when I stopped running from pain and started walking toward hope. It began when I learned that home is not a place you are born to. It is a place you choose and a community that chooses you back. And Clara would look out at her children and grandchildren, at the thriving town that had grown up around her, at the life she had built from the ashes of her losses, and she would smile. My journey ended with Sheriff Reed Callahan, she would say, and it began again with us, with love, with family, with the courage to believe I deserved a second chance. And that, my dears, made all the difference. On her last evening, many, many years after that first day at the depot, Clara sat on the porch of the house she and Reed had built together. He had passed 5 years earlier, peacefully in his sleep, and she had missed him every single day since. But she was unafraid of death. She had lived a full, rich life. She had loved and been loved. She had made a difference in the world, one student at a time, one act of kindness at a time. As the sun set over the Arizona Valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Clara closed her eyes and whispered the words that had sustained her through half a century of joy and sorrow. My journey ended with you, Reed Callahan, and it began again with us. Thank you for teaching me how to live. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for showing me that home is wherever love resides. The stars came out, the same stars that had witnessed her arrival in Silver Creek all those decades ago. And Clara Winthrop Callahan smiled, content in the knowledge that she had lived well, loved deeply, and left the world better than she had found it. Her journey had ended where it was always meant to, in love, in community, in the arms of a life well lived, and that was more than enough.